The first move of the offseason is in. The Vikings extend Theo Jackson. What does it mean for the rest of the room and for the draft? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome everybody to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Today on the show, it is 4-0 Friday. We are going to spend most of this show talking about the draft, which is what I intended to do from the outset, but we do have a little bit of news, and it's going to kind of color this conversation. So, Theo Jackson is extended, as reported by Tom Pelissero. I think had it first, and then everybody else got in on it. The total value is a 2-year extension worth $12.6 million. That is on top of the restricted free agent tender that he was in line to get this year. So it's kind of like they tendered him and then extended him, but they just made the first year equivalent to the tender, which is I think like 3.3 mil. So it's going to be like 15.9 or like call it $16 million over 3 years. However you feel about that, I think there's a signal to it, right? I don't think you give somebody 16 mil over 3 years if they're not going to play for you. That's not special teamer money. That's rotational player money in this environment. It's borderline, it's getting there, but that is not money you give to somebody just because they're like good on the kickoff team, right? Like they're going to do something for you from scrimmage. So last year, safeties played over 90% of the snaps. And the defensive back that was kind of in and out of the game was Shaq Griffin. He played about 50% of the snaps. We talk about this later in the show in the conversation with Tyler, which I've already recorded. So I wonder if Theo Jackson is the guy that's supposed to play 50% of the snaps now, and if this tells us something about their corner strategy. But I'll tell you this, in a month from now, all of these things are going to be abundantly clear and with no ambiguity to them at all. So there's no super big value in like speculating how their snap count rotations are going to work. We got to know who's in the room before we can really do that. But elsewhere in that nugget, so the Star Tribune staff, and Andrew Kramer in particular is who I'm citing here, also said, they're getting ahead of signing a valued riser like they did with Josh Metellus, who is also maybe going to be earning an extension. The Star Tribune people have heard that from a lot of people that a pay raise extension for Josh Metellus is also coming up. So that safety room appears to be the thing. Theo Jackson, Josh Metellus, that is the intention for the safety room. Whether or not Cam Bynum or Harrison Smith also have a part there is, I think, still up in the air. And if they do have a part, how long do they have a part for? Also still up in the air. But the two kind of young guys, Theo Jackson and Josh Metellus, are there. Theo Jackson is, I think, a pretty big W for Kwesi. He comes in 2022 as a 6th-round pick for the Titans that was claimed off of waivers. So they basically Marcus Epps this guy, like immediately undid the Marcus Epps thing. And immediately like got a safety the exact same way. So I think that's a big win there. And got not only value for him as depth, which as a 6th-round pick you would have been happy for it, but it wasn't the Vikings spending that 6th. They just got him for a waiver claim. But also now you might even get a little bit of rotation in from scrimmage. We'll see what Theo Jackson can do. He is kind of to me, I think of him as a center fielder type. Not that he doesn't get in the box, but I think of him more as his role is much more as, a like true cover safety. So that could mean he takes over the Cam Bynum job and competes with somebody for it. That could mean he takes over Harrison Smith's job and competes with somebody for it. That could mean, he just rolls in sometimes and plays center field for when you want to bring whatever safeties you have, when you want to bring them down into the box. Depends on what the rest of the room looks like. And we don't know that yet, but it does give us at least a little bit of an indication of what the Vikings will do in the draft. And I want to talk to you about that. So that will be what we go into with Tyler Forness. It's 4-0 Friday. Let us move right to that. So here to chime in on all of this with me, as always, on a Friday, it's Tyler Forness. It's 4-0 Fridays. We've got, 4 of these left before the draft? No, more than that. 6.
Like 8.
6, 7, 8. Okay, yeah, way more than that. What am I talking about? What up, Tyler? So you've been writing about Theo Jackson and also maybe a Josh Metellus extension or a Josh Metellus pay raise is on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
So from a draft perspective now, how does this change their potential strategy? We've seen a lot of mock drafts with safeties in there. Is that out the window now?
No, I don't think so. There's so many questions I have about how Brian Flores actually wants to run this defense, because how much of it, especially with the changes from year 1 to year 2, how much of it is what he actually wants to do versus what he feels like he has to do based on the personnel he has? Does he want to continue to run 3 safety sets, or did he feel like that was his best bet considering what the cornerback room was? And over the last couple of years, we can see why the Vikings didn't necessarily trust anybody past corner 3, and they didn't even trust corner 3 that much with Shaq Griffin not playing. I don't think he played 50% of the snaps. Like these things, I'm not really sure about. And because I'm not sure, I don't know. The top 2 safeties are Nick Emmanwori, who we talked about in the pre-combine episode, and Malachi Starks, who was basically the consensus number 1 safety up until a couple months ago when Emmanwori really people started to get into the tape on him. So if the Vikings want to continue running 3 safety sets, both guys can play nickel. Malachi Starks can actually play outside. And if you want to do a lot more zone stuff, I think Emmanwori could play outside corner too, even though he hasn't really done it, but he has the athleticism.
You rotate it. And you do it in if you're spinning the coverage and then he ends up somehow on the outside of a condensed formation or something like that.
In inverted, I wonder too.
Sure, yeah, that kind of thing too. But if you're an inverted Tampa 2, you're not man covering outside and you're just playing a squat flat zone, and that's everybody can do that. Mm-hmm. But so yeah, Shaq Griffin played about 50% of the snaps. I believe he was hurt for a hot second too. But so I call it a 50% of the snaps guy, but what's to stop Theo Jackson from being the 50% of the snaps guy and the Vikings from getting 3 corners that they do trust? Because I think that was more of a we like Josh Metellus more than we like Shaq Griffin thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas it could be, they could still absolutely get that safety and just run back the same kind of configuration they had before. But I just did yesterday a free agency plan where they bring back Byron Murphy, sign DJ Reed and Mike Hilton. Put those guys on the field every single snap, and Theo Jackson can come on in whenever you need him. So I guess where it's at for me is, okay, it's an option, but it doesn't have to be the only one with Theo Jackson if they really do believe in him that much and they're going to upgrade Josh Metellus's pay range to reflect what I think they expect from him. But I don't want to spend the whole show talking about secondary and getting stuck in here. So I want to talk to you about the running backs in 40 times, because it's this really slow, conservative, very responsible class of old school thumpers, but the 40 times are all over the place. How much does that matter? We'll get into that next on Locked On Vikings. Back with Tyler in just a second, but first, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Look, with FanDuel, you can place live bets at any point in the game. So if you're trying to get a bet off and you just miss tip-off, it doesn't matter. You can get the same line, probably. You can get the same thing as a live line, or at least something close as a live line, even if you're halfway through the first quarter because you turned the game on late. Or you can wait till halftime and feel out the game and see if there's going to be a comeback or not, or if there's going to be a clutch 3 in the fourth quarter. You can make those live bets. Whatever you're doing, use FanDuel's live betting feature, because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Even if one team is up by 30, suddenly that 29.5 point spread is kind of interesting. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Moving right along here with the Locked On Vikings podcast here with Tyler Forness, the real Forno. It's Forno Fridays. You and I have a running back we both really like. You want to get into him? You want to get into it?
Hey,
what did he run? What did it's DJ Giddens. What did he run?
Hey, he is an all Forno team member. He ran a 4.43, which to me
4.43
was mind blowing.
It doesn't. So I'm not sure I'm quite as surprised as you. But when I watched him, like you saw the top speed not be there. Like he would get into the open field, get
Mhm.
by everybody, and get hawked.
Yes.
You can't have that in the NFL, right? Like if you're getting hawked in college, you're going to get hawked like crazy
Yeah.
in the NFL. And so that kind of home run potential not necessarily there in the same way
Mhm.
it was for somebody like Junty who could just like torch everybody, or
Yeah.
I don't know what he ran, or
He
like
didn't.
Trivia. Oh, okay. So he's gonna do a pro day. Yeah, I'm gonna guess all the top guys, or like Travion Hendrickson
He
or
ran, I think, a
Henderson.
4.41, so he's in the same ballpark.
That's wild because watching Henderson and watching Giddens is different, but it
Mhm.
wasn't quite as different to me than like Caleb Johnson, who I expected to run. He barely beat a 4.5, right? Like I expected a
He
4.5 something. He did a little
he
better
was
than that.
4.57. Like,
Oh, he
to me,
was 4. I thought he did like a 4.49, or was that? Am I thinking of
no.
somebody else? Okay,
I think
4.5.
you're
Yeah.
thinking someone else.
So like the difference between those two guys jumped out to me on tape, but being that close to someone like Henderson is pretty surprising for me. So like, okay, measured speed versus game speed. Well, the NFL
Mhm.
teams are going on game speed. They have the chip data. So how do we as lay people like differentiate? Like how do we parse that out when we see something on tape but it doesn't match what happened on the day?
I think it's really interesting because, and you kind of mentioned it at the top, track speed is not game speed. Some guys are fast on the track that are just not fast on the field. And it's a different kind of speed because there's a different ramp up. When you're running track, you come out of the blocks and you explode in a much different way than when you're a running back and you're basically in a 2 point stance. You got your hands on your knees, and then your feet are level with each other, and then you basically got to flip them
Mhm.
and then push off. It's just a different level. Plus, there's the element of vision, and you have to be able to hit the hole. And with how the Vikings like to run outside zone, which Giddens ran a lot of those kind of concepts in college at Kansas State, it's more about cutback, and then you're trying to get up to top speed. You're not going out of the blocks.
Right.
So parsing all that out is interesting. And what
You have
I
like two like kind of gather steps where you're reading
yeah
and
yeah
then you make your decision and then you got to go, but you're going from an upright posture. And I wonder how many people like, I feel like the people that really kill the 40 but don't end up fast are the ones that work really hard at getting out of the sprinters blocks in the
mhm.
off season and
And
really practice that, which won't translate to the NFL at all, but it'll get them drafted higher and make them more money. Versus guys that just keep working on their running back stuff, or just, take the time to heal if they were injured or something like that, use those other 2 months for like literally anything else.
And that's why in the pre-combine episode, we talked about the flying 20 being so important, because once you're at your top speed, how fast are you really? And that's where some of this GPS data comes into play. Obligatory shut up, Kevin. But Kevin covers Kansas State.
Kevin,
And
actual Kevin, the real
actually,
Kevin. The
this
thing
day,
is, in the mailbag episodes, the Town Hall Tuesday episodes, many people are masquerading as Kevin now.
I love that so much.
But the only one is ever the real Kevin, and I think I probably get it right about half the time.
It's awesome. But he covers Kansas State, and something that he told me was people thought he was much faster than like consensus believed. I thought he was like a 4.53 guy, where like I think Aaron Jones ran a 4.55 when he was at the combine. I kind of equated those guys to in a very similar package where they're gonna burst, they're gonna get you 40, they're not gonna get you 70. And
Hmm.
I was very comfortable with that in like end of round
Yeah,
two,
that's
round three.
for like Omarion
More
Hampton. I feel that way about him. He will get you
Hampton
40, but not 70. And like, who cares? You got 40.
Hampton's weird because he's big, but it's almost like that Derrick Henry thing where once he's going, you're not going to catch him, but you can catch him as he's getting to top
Yeah,
speed.
where he
And
doesn't get to top speed. And you
yeah.
can divide up the 40 to get like a sense for these things with like
Mhm.
the 10-yard split and the flying 20 and all that.
Yeah. But what's really interesting about Giddens specifically is, and I was having this discussion earlier today as we record on Thursday. Like, I did not see this guy who ran 4.43 on tape. I thought he was a 4.53 guy. And people I talked to who I really respect thought 4.48. Like, you could convince me of 4.48, which 0.05,
Hmm.
okay, that's analogous. It's whatever. But a 0.1 second difference is significant when you're having these conversations. And one thing that was brought to my attention, he never broke 21 miles per hour on the GPS based on public data available. So that to me is a very interesting one, because if you want to talk about how fast the player really is on game speed, the only way to really track that is GPS data. And even
Yeah.
that so far, Luke, we don't have enough. And this is what I would really love to ask Kwesi. With GPS data, how do you try to determine like, what's a good threshold? Because we don't have a ton of like back data yet. How do you determine like where you should
Hmm.
be? How do you determine what's good, what's bad, what you can count on, what you can rely on, what's an outlier, what's a constant? It I don't have the answers to these things, and maybe they do, but
Maybe.
there's so many different things to parse out in a limited data set. And that to me, as we start to transition and that being more and more of a factor in how these guys get drafted, how do we figure those things out and how quickly does that happen?
Yeah, you and I are stuck. We don't have any of it. I
Yeah.
think they have back data for that chip stuff going to like 2016 or 2017. Like they've got a few years now,
Would
and
you
people whose
consider that
careers
a
have
good
played
enough
all the way
data
out that
set
you can
though?
tell.
Would you consider that a good enough data set?
Not for like longitudinal, but I think it's starting. Like I would say 2 or 3 years, you're really shooting in the dark. But once you have league wide, it's a lot of players. I mean, that's, with undrafted guys, it's probably 300, 400 data points.
Mhm.
And call it 8 years of it. Yeah, I think you're starting to get where you can probably pull out enough trends to get something. But they've been using that also on on internal levels to measure guys like Adam Thielen as he got older, like Xavier Rhodes as he got older. They've been using that internally for a while too. So you can at least get a sense for thresholds of you have to be able to accelerate the first 5 yards, this well in a back pedal to be able to do it. So I think
Mhm.
you probably have reasonable data sets, but yeah, like there's probably enough sample size where you just have to be smart about the margin of error you're applying to those data sets.
Mhm.
Speaking of, okay, so I just pulled up the splits for the 40s for Hampton and Giddens. And it's so funny. They have the exact same 10 split, 156. 2.6 20-yard split or 2.59 20-yard split. Marion Hampton wins it by 100th. However, DJ Giddens ends up 400ths ahead from the flying 20. So has a better flying 20. So that kind of uh that kind of runs counter to what you said again. Like if you about Hampton, where he did accelerate about as fast as Giddens, but Giddens ended
Mhm.
up having a better top speed to get to. But maybe the 40 yards isn't enough for Hampton to get to his top speed, which again, like in an outside zone situation, you might clear 30, 40 yards before you actually are past the first down marker because you got to
Mhm.
go all the way out and around. And so that's all the acceleration that you're doing. Nobody really ever runs in a straight line in football unless they're doing something wrong. Like you probably are just running in a straight
Yeah,
line,
exactly.
which is what makes this like chip data there. But like, I guess to refocus this, when we're talking about a running back, what we want from speed, like what we're looking for, what are the practical effects? For me, it's like I care about, can you burst through the hole? If you can get into the second
Mhm.
level, good things will happen. And most of these guys have done enough juking and jiving in their high school and college careers where it just sort of becomes about instinct. But also from a data perspective, the difference between a 5 yard run that got into the second level and an 8 yard run that got into the second level is marginal. You're either way, you've set up a good second down. And similarly, the difference between a 15 yard run and a 30 yard run, well, you got your first down. Now it's just field position. It's not nothing, doesn't not matter, but it's marginal. So I care about you getting those first 4 yards efficiently, and then I
Mhm.
care about you getting 10 to 15 efficiently. Those are the sort of cliffs where a run really goes from bad to medium to
Mhm.
good. And so I care a lot about like 10 split stuff with running backs and burst. But really, I look at it and I look at them and I go, can you burst through the hole? Because if you don't have the acceleration, if you make decisions quickly, you can get through that hole, even if you aren't, the accelerator that you maybe used to be. Like for older running backs, I think they can make a
Mhm.
living that way. So that's where I'm at on this. But like, what do you look for with speed with a running back when you're actually watching them? What like is the bar you're looking for them to hit?
So I think you brought up a really interesting point that we can kind of dive into when it comes to just the Vikings 2024 room, Ty Chandler versus Aaron Jones. You can run in the four
Mm,
threes, but if your eyes are 0.2 seconds slow, you're a 4.5 guy, and it doesn't matter. But
exactly.
Aaron Jones is so
This is the
quick in
Kyle
how he makes.
Hamilton 4-6 thing. He left 2
Yeah.
steps early. It didn't matter that he was 2 steps slower.
And Jones was a much better processor. He can hit the hole even though he's slower in both burst and top speed, where Chandler was taking too long to process some of those things. And now you see why Jones has made such a living in the National Football League for so long, because he sees things really well and he's able to attack those holes. But speed is a two-parter. You got to have the speed with your vision, and then your feet need to match it. And you have to be able to sync those two things up. If you can do that, that's great. The second part is, if you're running a sweep or you bust it to the outside, you better be able to hit the edge. You better be able to
get around.
If
Which
you
is,
can't
again, it's
do
like
it
the first 5-10 yards of it is 10 split. It's that speed.
If you can't do it in college, you can't do it in the National Football League. But
yeah, for sure. They get a little faster when suddenly it's, Myles Garrett and Max Crosby on the outside.
Yeah. But if you can do it in college, there's going to be some relative expectation you're going to be able to do it at least a little bit in the National Football League, depending on who's playing. So if you can do it there, then I can trust you. Okay, now I know we can do stuff like toss. We can, if you have a tendency to bounce it to the outside, which we know a lot of these guys like to do. Genty had some of that issue where the offensive line may have been a little jumbled up and he just want to bust outside and be able to take a lane. He was good enough of an athlete and vision wise to be able to do those things and be able to bounce off of tacklers. And I think he had one against Washington State where he bounced off 9 guys and ran it like 70 yards for a touchdown, because he's just an absolutely bonkers human being. But speed is relative. If you are slow with your eyes, I don't care if you run 4.3. It does not matter, because you will get, unless there's a wide open hole. Because the San Francisco game, Ty Chandler, 10 carries, 81 yards. He just kept hitting the hole and exploding through. And it's like, okay, we might have something this guy. 2 weeks later, Cam Akers is back on the team, because Akers has good enough eyes to be able to take advantage of some of those things, where Chandler's aren't.
He at least makes a decision. Whether it's the right decision is different, but at least makes one. Next up, so news is like breaking while we're doing this. There's Raekwon Davis is released now by the Colts. All these defensive tackles have hit the market that won't count toward the compensatory formula. And so I want to ask about the DT class and to see these two things maybe are in conflict here and decisions are to be made. So that'll be next on Locked On Vikings. All right, moving right along here with the Locked On Vikings podcast. Maybe the most often, corner is probably the most often thing mocked to the Vikings, but I see a lot of D tackles, a lot of Derek Harmon or Walter Nolan, or pick your guy, right? Kenneth Grant, if you really want to dream big. But in the last 24 hours, the market of D tackles in free agency has filled up with names. Javon Hargrave, Jonathan Allen, apparently a trade's not materializing. Raekwon Davis, as we speak, just got released. However you feel about those guys is neither here nor there. What I want to focus on is, with a very robust D tackle market that already was full of interesting names, and Milton Williams and the Chiefs guy Wharton and all these guys, do you feel as though the draft class is good enough to make you a little less interested in that? Is this D tackle draft class all it's made up to be at pick 24? Is this a place where, nah, we're going to let all those guys go. We're getting a guy at 24. We don't need to do the Jonathan Allen, hope he's healthy game.
I think you can do both. And one of the things you mentioned is all these guys that are getting released. This is where Kwesi Adofo-Mensah can end up recouping draft capital. Sign guys who were cut because they don't count towards the comp pick formula. If you lose Darnold and Daniel Jones and Cam Bynum, guess what? That could be a 3rd and 2/4, or a 3rd, 4th, and a 5th. And those can just end up helping you next year.
3rd and 2/4, I think, if they get the contracts that they're projected to get.
Yeah.
I just did a whole episode on exactly this. It'd be a 3rd and 2/4. But what I will say is, in that episode as well, you don't necessarily have to. You just need guys like Reisner and Gilmore and Cam Robinson to actually count toward the formula, which isn't guaranteed if they sign late. If they sign after June 1st, it doesn't count. Age things might mean that there's a limit to what they can. So snap counts, and if Reisner signs but doesn't actually play, it might not count. Stuff is weird. You need those guys to count, but for each of those guys that don't count, you can sort of remake up the capital on the formula by signing Rayshon Jenkins instead of going out and getting Javon Holland, that kind of thing.
And I think,
or by bringing back Theo Jackson and giving him a job he didn't have last year.
Exactly. And I think those things are ways to capitalize on the market to your advantage. The Baltimore Ravens have the most ever compensatory draft picks awarded, 56. The Vikings are league average at 16th with 28. And what the Ravens do, they wait for guys to get cut, and then they sign them. And they get good players. Now, you may not get the cream of the crop. You may have to deal with a guy who's 32. But we've seen Kwesi Adofo-Mensah be willing to sign guys in their 30s to 1-year deals and just help out. Jonathan Allen, sign him to a 1-year deal. And you know what? Then draft a guy at 24. What's interesting is looking at my mock draft tracker, because I track it every week, 242 mock drafts so far through 9 weeks. The top 3 are all corners. The next 3 are defensive tackles, Derek Harmon, Walter Nolan, and Kenneth Grant, all of which theoretically could be available at 24th overall, depending on how the Vikings want to handle it and how things go ahead of them. I think you can double down. The draft is where you acquire talent. Just get a good football player. Who cares about position? Obviously, don't take a quarterback, but take a good player and use the free agency period to be able to fortify your needs. I think Jonathan Allen, like a 2 or 3 year deal, if you believe he can stay healthy, would be a great bet, because you could probably get it between $10 and $15 million per year. And he already has a desire to play here, according to Doogie, which I think there might be a connection with him and JJ McCarthy. Not 100% sure on that, so don't quote me, but that's
with Kenneth Grant. I mean, that would kind of make sense.
No, with Jonathan Allen, which is kind of weird. But that somebody I trust told me that, which I found very interesting. But find a way to do both. Like, even if you can't get a guy in round 1, trade back into round 2, pick up a day 2 pick, and then get a guy there. There's talent to be had across the board. You don't have to force it. Heck, you can get a guy like CJ West in like round 4, round 5 out of Indiana, who basically played nose tackle, but there's some real talk he could play 3 tech, and he's got the explosiveness to be able to do that. I think he jumped 33 or 34 inches of the combine. He ran really well at 315 pounds. Like, there's so much talent in this draft. Don't force it. Just get good football players. Fortify the needs now. Figure the rest out at the draft. As long as it's a good player, who cares?
And like, I feel like free agency serves the draft because free agency goes first, right?
Yeah.
And when you are like the Vikings, you have a bunch of needs, right? If the Vikings had to play a game tomorrow, they'd be in big trouble at a bunch of positions. And they have to figure out their answers to that. But what you don't want to do, I always bring up the Treadwell pick, because the Vikings walked into the 2015 draft needing a receiver and only a receiver, and being very locked into picking a receiver. A couple of guys get picked in front of them, including Josh Doxson, who they really wanted. Very funny, they were wrong about both these guys, but they were unhappy with Treadwell at the time. They felt like they settled. You could feel it, that they felt like, right, I guess we'll take Treadwell. Like, they weren't happy with it, but they didn't have the flexibility to just turn around and take somebody else off of that board. And they also just misevaluated Michael Thomas. That's a different thing. Lots of stuff went wrong there. Yeah. I mean, he went in the second round, right? And he ended up being the best receiver in that class.
Mm-hmm.
But that's this kind of situation you don't want to be stuck in, right? So for me, as we are about to enter free agency, this is likely the last podcast a lot of these listeners hear before free agency opens, unless you listen really early on Monday morning to the Monday morning show. But in terms of the draft, what you want to do is make it so that there are no emergencies. You don't need to fill every single need. You can use the draft to fill a need, but you need at least to have some kind of, I'll call it, serious answer, something that won't get you laughed out the door. Yeah. And that could mean that D tackle is bring back Jonathan Bullard and, have Harrison Phillips and, some like $4 million whoever that you get, just to say, okay, we've got a group that technically could work, just in case there's a huge run on D tackles right in front of us, and now we don't want to have to end up like reaching on someone, or picking CJ West 2 rounds before we're supposed to, just because we need a guy so much. You don't want to be in that situation where your hand is forced. Get a serious answer and hope. I think for me, corner is going to be the hardest one to do that for, where you need to have like a group built. Whereas if you can't get anybody, like if all the corners you like are gone by the time you pick at 24, you don't want to be priced into taking the guy you didn't have that good of a grade on, but maybe everybody else thinks he's a first rounder. That's how you like Emmanuel Forbes this.
Yes, absolutely. Just be smart, be calculated. And I think even though the Twitter sphere might say that he's the worst GM of all time, I think Kwesi Adofo-Mensah did a pretty good job with the draft the last couple of years, especially with how he's evolved his process. And I think we should feel pretty confident. Oh, it's so incredibly different. I'm gonna write about that here once I have like
Yeah,
a couple free
the
hours.
factors that, because 2022 was such a mess, right? And the factors that led to 2022, I think if you expect those to repeat themselves, you have not paid attention. They
Exactly.
have cleared out all of the scouts. They've completely reorganized how they do the draft process, and Kwesi has increased the amount of control he has. Whereas in that 2022 class, he was being like very Mr. Delegation. He was, basically taking everyone's word for stuff and trying to be humble about how he's not a guy with a football background, so I'm going to let my football guys do the thing. The decisions that have gone well, he's been way more interested in the last couple of years, and like to the benefit of the Vikings, which is how, getting Addison and Hawkinson first round, second round in 2023, and then we'll see how Blackman goes. And then of course, falling in love with JJ McCarthy. He had every bit about that. Like, he and Kevin O'Connell very on the same page about that, and not really wanting Kirk Cousins. And I think one of the better things this front office has done was not fall for it again and, let him walk. Well, that was entirely driven by Kwesi, at least in terms of like my understanding is Kevin O'Connell could have very easily been talked into keeping Kirk for a little longer. He loved working with Kirk. It was easy. Kwesi was very much like, nope, here's our price. Here's our thing. Here's our line in the sand. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the last two draft classes continue to develop. Obviously Addison, we can call that a hit pretty comfortably. Hawkinson, indirect. It's not drafting, but a good use of draft capital. And then, Blackman, Dallas Turner, JJ McCarthy, all these guys, that jury is still kind of out on because we've only seen a year. And with McCarthy, we haven't even seen that. So we'll see how we'll see how that goes. I would love to talk to you more about that the process of the draft, and how by the time you get to the day, it's sort of too late to make any to make any improvements. But we're out of time, so we got to do that another day. So Tyler, thank you so much for your time. You just wrote about Theo Jackson, right? People can find that over at A to Z.
Yep, they can find that, and you can find my beautifully tan face from Playa del Carmen.
We'll go
my
with that.
YouTube channel.
That's what it is. Yep. All right, Tyler, thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks so much for listening to This Week on Locked On Vikings. It is free agency next week, so we're going to be locked in. We're going to be live on the Minnesota Football Party. I think I'm only going to be there for a little bit of it, but you can still go check that out. And of course, all of that's going to be up on audio here on Locked On Vikings. But of course, we're going to also have episodes every morning, just like always, because this is a show that brings you your team every day. I will see you all next week. And as always, Skol.